Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History by Podcast. I'm live with Dr. Dan McClellan, and just want to say hi to Dan's audience as well, since we're dual streaming. And that being said, welcome back to the show, Dan.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me. So today's topic is how people reimagine Paul, both in the past and in the present as well. Do you feel like both in the past and the present, that people have reinterpreted Paul or renegotiate Paul's text to kind of fit what they want to believe, even if it contradicts Paul's letters, and they see the contradictions, but they're like, nah, it's not really there because somehow my interpretation makes everything fit together.
Yeah, I think they're definitely doing that, and there are a few different reasons for this. One is obviously the fact that the circumstances that resulted in Paul's writings changed very shortly after Paul's death. And we even see that in some of the letters that were written in Paul's name after his death. For instance, Paul expected the second coming to be any day now, telling everybody, hey, stay in the circumstances in which you were when you were called by God, and keep a lookout. You don't want to be caught unaware. These things were expected to happen immediately. Decades after his death, you see other folks writing in his name saying, hey, second coming's going to take a bit. It's not going to come till after, oh, we got this man of perdition who's got to show up. We've got this falling away that's got to happen. We're going to take a little more time with this. Let's settle into our social circumstances. Oh, we got a church structure to worry about. So already they're renegotiating Paul in the New Testament. But then when you get outside of the New Testament and those texts are juxtaposed and you're treating the pastoral epistles and Ephesians and Colossians and 2 Thessalonians as Pauline, then you have to find a way to make A and B equal each other, which means you've got to impose C, some kind of unifying framework, some way to make them all agree also, and you've got to make it meaningful to your own particular circumstances. So there are a lot of different factors that come into play in that negotiation. And so it's a constant trying to figure out a new way to make this relevant, meaningful, useful to us. And so whatever Paul actually viewed, whatever his actual views were, they're not irretrievable, but virtually irretrievable to those who take the text as an inspired or an authoritative text.
Now, it's not just forgeries being attributed to Paul. There's also redacting going on, even in what is believed to be the authentic letters of Paul, like interpolating is going on. And there could be more interpolations than we even know about. But I want to talk about 1 Corinthians 14:44-45. A lot of people cite that and say, okay, they'll cite that and say, okay, that's evidence that the pastorals fit with the authentic letters of Paul. Because look at that.
Yeah,
it's the same thing as something I see in 1 Timothy about the way Paul is supposedly talking about women being quiet in churches.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know you talked about this, and other scholars have talked about this, that's an interpolation, but is it missing from any manuscripts of 1 Corinthians, or does it only just move around?
It moves around. It comes after, it's around verse 40 in some manuscripts, which is, scholars have pointed out, this probably indicates some scribes were a little uncomfortable with its placement at 34 and 35, because it kind of interrupts a discourse that's already ongoing. And so some scribes were probably like, let's move it back here at the end of the discourse, and then it's a little more comfortable for us. So the fact that it moves around isn't itself definitive evidence that it was not original to the text. But I think the fact that it kind of conflicts with 1 Corinthians 11, the notion that we have women praying and prophesying in the churches, in their gatherings, flatly contradicts this notion that they're not even allowed to lean over and ask their husband a question. They've got to wait until they get back home because it's shameful for women to speak in church. So that's, I think, another piece of evidence. And then the fact that it seems to resonate so much with what's going on in 1 Timothy is a third piece of evidence. that I think make a pretty strong case. But it would be nice if we had an early manuscript where it just wasn't there. But I don't think that we have any such manuscripts.
How do scholars go about in determining what is authentic to Paul and what is not?
That's it's a complex question, and a lot of people are never going to be satisfied with the answer. But really, what most scholars do will look at the texts that are considered that nobody questions. Things like Romans, First and Second Corinthians, First Thessalonians, Galatians, Philemon, Philippians. Those are pretty universally considered Pauline, and there is a kind of consistency in the style and the vocabulary that is used, as well as in the theology, the soteriology, the Christology. There is a consistency, and then also the apocalyptic outlook is very consistent. And so, in some of the letters, you have things that don't seem to fit. The style is different. So Colossians, for instance, you have a single sentence that's like 5 verses long. Like that's not really how Paul writes Greek. And so it's very un-Pauline in that regard. And then in Colossians, it'll say things like, we died in Jesus and we have resurrected with Jesus, where it says the believers have already been raised up with Jesus. Whereas in the indisputed Pauline epistles, Paul repeatedly says we've not yet been raised up. And so there's some conflict there that suggests to an awful lot of scholars that this is written in a different time period. Second Thessalonians is rejected by a lot of scholars as Pauline because that's where we get this idea that the end is not yet to come. Put you can take your shoes back off, relax. The man of perdition, we got to have this falling away, all this kind of stuff, which is kind of qualifying what Paul was saying in the undisputed Pauline epistles, where he's saying this is at the doorstep, this is right around the corner, this is coming, everybody get ready. So it's content, it's style, it's the terminology, and particularly when it comes to the pastoral epistles, the terminology is very different. There are a bunch of words that are not that are not found at all in the Pauline epistles, but are very common to Hellenistic literature from the end of the 1st century CE, beginning of the 2nd century CE. So just from like a statistical point of view, the most likely time period for the composition of the pastoral epistles, just looking at how frequently these words occur, would be the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, well after Paul's death. And then there are conceptual things that are different. Like in the pastoral epistles, you have a different representation of like righteousness. It's treated in a very different way. The body is not really talked about at all, but it's a very important part of Paul's undisputed epistles. And so there's a lot of different stuff, and there are a lot of different ways to account for this. Some people say, oh, well, Paul used amanuensis, a scribe, to dictate the letters, and sometime that scribe injected a lot more of their own thinking and things like that. We don't really have evidence for authors giving notes to a scribe and saying, yeah, just make it sound pretty, and then going off and writing long letters like what we find in the New Testament. So that's not a strong argument. The notion that, well, Paul got older and Paul changed his mind, there's not really evidence that that's going on either. When we weigh the probabilities, the side of the weight just falls on the side of this is somebody else writing. This is not Paul writing these letters. Although there is still argument about some of them. The pastoral epistles, I think the majority of scholars agree that is not Pauline. Hebrews, barely anybody thinks that's Pauline. But then you've got like Second Thessalonian, Colossians, Ephesians, where I think the majority of scholars probably think it's not Pauline, but it's a small majority.
Some might say that, like, oh, look, like in Second Thessalonians and in First Thessalonians, First, Second Corinthians, it's like 2 people writing it or 3 people writing it. It's like, look at the beginning of it. There's co-authors. So maybe that's what's going on. Different styles of writing or different theological points of view might be creeping in from co-authors. What do you think about that?
It's possible. The data that we have from the literary world from that time period doesn't indicate that that was something that happened an awful lot. Usually it was dictation. There could be little insertions here and there from a scribe. In fact, we have that where at the end of one or two of Paul's letters, the scribe butts in and says, I wrote this and things like that. But there's just not a lot of evidence that that kind of thing was common. So for critical scholars, this is ginning up scenarios to try to make the desired conclusion sound more plausible. And there's a plausibility to it, but when we weigh the different plausibilities, it just comes out more likely for most folks. Most folks who do not have a vested interest in Pauline authorship. If you are convinced that the authorship is Pauline, if you need it to be Pauline, you're not going to be convinced by those arguments, because even intuitively, subconsciously, you're just going to be nudged in the direction of feeling like it makes more sense to you that Paul could have changed his mind, Paul could be getting older, Paul could have been using a scribe who is introducing these things.
What do you think that the author of the pseudo Paul that wrote Second Thessalonians meant by son of lawlessness? Because some people try to equate that with the beast of Revelation or the Antichrist in the Johannine epistles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, these are three different sets of texts written by different authors who had different understandings of the divine world and what kinds of entities were out there. So I think conflating them all is a bad move. It's kind of presupposing univocality. If somebody says son of lawlessness and somebody else says antichrist and somebody else says beast, and you kind of just want them all to be the same thing because that helps you harmonize everything, that's a very presuppositional approach to things. But I think they just had different concepts of there has to be a villain out there, and the son of lawlessness who's going to be revealed. This has a bit of a Hebrew flavor, because you have sons of Belial in Greco-Roman period Jewish literature. You have this notion of sons of X is a way to refer to members of given categories. You have the sons of the prophets, you have the sons of gods, you have the daughters of humanity. You have the Son of Man, which just meant a mortal, but then became a Christological or a messianic and then Christological title. So it just sounds like any one of a number of different malevolent divine forces that was going to be manifested. It doesn't necessarily mean the author of Second Thessalonians had the same profile in mind that the author of the Johannine epistles or the author of Revelation had in mind. That doesn't really make much sense to me.
And before I shift to discuss the more modern viewpoints that some people have about Paul, what gives scholars confidence, such as yourself, that Paul's letters were written specifically in the 50s CE? Why put it there?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. That starts from just what we were able to reconstruct about Paul's life. We created kind of a little chronological window and then try to situate the letters where we can. Sometimes that's using like the book of Acts as a bit of a help, but that's limited because it doesn't really line up well with what Paul says he was doing. And so usually it has to do with kind of arranging chronologically how we think the events went down, Paul's travels went, so where he would have been at a given time, and then just kind of estimating so much time may have passed or kind of spreading them out within that window. It's not an incredibly precise science, but any good commentary on any of the individual books will talk in the beginning about how they determined the date. And usually they're not going to be much more precise than a window of maybe as many as 5 to 10 years. So it's an awful lot of guesswork, but you usually try to nail down as securely as you can the extremes of that window and then suggest what you think is most likely within that window.
So with the different kind of denominations of Christianity that exist today that push either an egalitarian view on Paul or they even try to change certain things about Paul to make it look like he's talking about events of today, kind of like we discussed last time when we were talking about Revelation.
Mhm.
They'll do the same thing to Paul's letters, even with Second Thessalonians when they assume that's written by Paul. And I was like, oh, it's not laws in someone from today, not really the past. And they'll lump in the Antichrist and the beast all together, as we just talked about.
Mhm.
Do you think that, and that's from not just from back then, but like from then to now, has Paul been far more overinterpreted in like perhaps worse ways than he used to be in the past?
I don't know about worse ways. Certainly, Paul gets overinterpreted, and there are some ways that a lot of Christians these days are more committed to the ideologies that they find in the epistles of Paul than that they find in the words of Jesus. And so I think Paul has become one of the main interpretive lenses for looking at the New Testament and for the development of Christian ideologies, particularly about social interactions, about the household, about soteriology. Um, Not when it comes to the afterlife. For instance, post-mortem divine punishment. Paul doesn't really talk an awful lot about that, and a lot of scholars think that Paul is a bit of a universalist. Because he talks about, for instance, in Second Corinthians, there's a guy who's been having inappropriate sexual relations, and so Paul suggests they cut him off and deliver him to the buffetings of Satan, so that his soul may be saved in the end, which seems to suggest that Satan is performing a kind of cleansing punishment. The suffering is there to purify the individual, so that ultimately they will be saved. And but that doesn't take priority over the discussions about hell that we find elsewhere in the New Testament. I think these days there are a lot of scholars who have made their careers talking about Paul and overinterpreting Paul. So, but there is a clear trend that we see as scholars have tried to figure out how to situate Paul, where Paul is more Jewish than Greco-Roman, and then Paul is more Greco-Roman than Jewish. And then we have the new perspective on Paul. Matthew Thiessen's recent book on Paul, a Jewish Paul, is, I think, a great discussion and a very accessible discussion of how scholarship on Paul has progressed over the years, and he's trying to resituate it a little more carefully, so that we're not just trying to leverage Paul to support our own identity politics today, or make Paul into a 21st century Christian. But understanding Paul on his own terms is phenomenally difficult, because none of us ever lived in the time period he lived in, the circumstances he lived in. And it's hard for us just to reconstruct what we think his rhetorical goals were, what he was responding to. And as you mentioned earlier, there seems to be editing and redacting going on. And, he was supposed to have written another epistle to the Corinthians. And some people think that part of that has actually been edited into one of the letters already. And so it's not a clear picture we're getting of Paul, but for folks who believe that the text is inspired, who believe that it has something authoritative and inspired to say about us today, they've got to find a way to make it fit into the square peg of 21st century Christianity. And frequently that's going to mean over interpreting it, and really generating a lot of new, fresh perspectives just for the sake of having something interesting to say that can make Paul continue to be relevant. But, there's over the course of 2,000 years, there are only so many different readings you can arrive at that that have any real plausibility.
So do you think that First and Second Corinthians or even Philippians was multiple letters that have been compressed down to one
Um,
each?
It wouldn't surprise me about the Corinthian letters. I haven't looked at the evidence for the Philippian letters, but certainly there are kind of conceptual pivots that could be possible breaks where some other text was worked in. But I'm not enough of a Paul scholar to be able to comment on that evidence. But yeah, it's certainly possible.
From your studies of Paul, was Paul to you more leaning towards or away from Torah?
That's the big question, and I think that Paul was suggesting that the law was fulfilled. I think the idea is not the rejection of Torah, but it was certainly that the folks who were coming into Christianity from outside of Judaism, from the Greco-Roman world, were not under the law, and so should not be put under the law. So I think there's definitely an attempt to and I think a very successful attempt to reason away the need to observe these social conventions and these ceremonial regulations and things like that, without necessarily saying that the law is obliterated or done away with, but that what it requires is already fulfilled in Jesus, and so what is required of us is something, or what continues to be required of Christians is something different. But that's a big debate. There's still lots of different thoughts on exactly what the law, the works of the law, and things like that are in Paul and some of the other authors in the New Testament. For instance, James, who talks a bit about the works. So yeah, I would leave that to the experts to drill down to the conceptual bedrock of the law.
And what do you think Paul's view of Jesus was?
I think Paul probably had what I think would have been a pretty standard mid first century CE Greco-Roman Jewish perspective, which would have been informed by earlier messianic literature that understood God to have had some kind of second power in heaven, or vice regent, or something like that, either an exalted human or a leading angel or something like that. And I think we probably see something like this in the hymn in Philippians 2, where we have this idea that that Jesus gave up this status as being in the form of God, which, by the way, pretty much all scholars agree this is not a reference to divine nature, but to some kind of appearance, divine appearance, or status, in the sense of an angel would have the form of the divine, and emptied or made himself a slave, which probably refers to incarnation. I think Paul Holloway has a great argument in his Hermeneia commentary on Philippians that this is a kind of standard metamorphosis narrative where the divine is taking on human form. So it's metamorphosis in the sense of Ovid and not Kafka. But then, as a result of fulfilling this divine plan, it says then God has more highly exalted him and given him the name that is above every name, which, in my opinion, is the endowment with the divine name, the tetragrammaton, the vehicle for divine agency and authority and presence. And in that sense, as Jesus manifests the divine presence. So I think Paul was much closer to something that we see in like the Apocalypse of Abraham or the Enochic literature with the Son of Man, or with Yahoel, or something like what we see with Metatron, the Adonai Katon in later Jewish literature. I don't think Paul took the later Trinitarian position. I don't think Paul took the same position that the author of John takes in the with the Logos hymn at the beginning of John. I think that's much more closely related to something that Philo would have thought of. But I think Paul is a little more in the Jewish mainstream in that regard. But easily reinterpreted in the direction of the later Trinitarian idea.
Do you think that the historical Paul could have known about the works of Philo or similar works to that of Philo?
I imagine Paul was pretty well informed. We see that Paul is reading Greco-Roman literature, is aware of the philosophers, and I would have to. Well, let's see. Philo is operating. Philo's going to talk to the Caesar in, I think, after Paul's death or around the time of Paul's death. They would have almost been contemporaries. So I think he probably would have been aware of the writings, but I don't know what Paul would have thought about Philo. He might have rejected him as some kind of zealot or something like that. Who knows? But Paul was a little bit of a zealot himself.
And I want to go back to the present day reinterpretations of Paul for a moment. What would you say are some of the, maybe this is a strong word, but what are the perhaps dangers in reinterpreting Paul to fit modern day context that you've encountered when you look at what people's videos that you criticized on the internet, when they try to defend the pastorals or even other letters of Paul or reinterpret them to fit their present view?
I think one of the biggest dangers, and one of the ones that I always am worried about, is that Paul is being used to structure power and values in the service of contemporary identity politics, and very frequently in the service of right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, which means there are going to be vulnerable folks who are going to be left out, who are going to be disenfranchised, who are going to be further minoritized and marginalized. And so my biggest concern is for trying to leverage Paul to demonize, to villainize, and for some folks out there, particularly on Twitter, even to criminalize minority groups and folks who are trying to live a Christian life as they understand it, whether they be women who are pastors, which gets called out an awful lot on social media and elsewhere, or LGBTQ plus Christians who want to be Christians, want to be part of that community, and are being actively demonized and even dehumanized by folks. And yeah, there's even a degree to which Paul is used, particularly things like Romans 13, to kind of prop up nationalism and the notion that Christians should be in charge of the government, and that we should basically live in a theocracy. I think those are incredibly harmful to groups of people who are already very vulnerable. And Paul was not writing for a 21st century audience. Paul had absolutely no concept of the kinds of social circumstances we live in today. And sometimes I will comment on this practice of counterfactual history. People want to imagine, what would Paul think of things today? And there are so many different ways you can think about that, because a question is, okay, are we just taking Paul right before he died, or maybe right before he was imprisoned, and he's just time traveling to the future, and suddenly, bam, he's here, and now we got to teach him English? And then are we going to teach him world history? Are we going to say, here's how we got to where we are? Or are we just going to say, look at that over there, what do you think about that? And he's going to be saying, I don't know what you're talking about, but he's saying it in Koine Greek. Are we saying, well, what happened if we took Paul, but then we reverted him to an infant, and he were raised in a contemporary society? Would the mind of Paul, conditioned to a 21st century society, what would he think about it? Are we sitting him down for a few years and saying, okay, we're going to get you up to date on everything that's happened. We're going to, teach you all the history. Is he going to be sympathetic to the different social groups that are struggling for power now? They're going to be completely different from the ones that existed anciently. Is he going to look at history and be like, we're the bad guys now? We're the baddies because we have taken over. We have become this empire. We are now the ones at the levers of power. Like, there's just so many different ways to contemplate what would Paul think about today, that there's no way you could say, well, that's the right one. And so I just think it's so dangerous for people to just kind of arbitrarily just deploy Paul in whatever way serves their interests. And yeah, that's something that bothers me quite a bit.
So what do you think that Paul meant by Romans 13:1-7 when he appears to be suggesting obedience to the state?
I think what a lot of scholars would say is that Paul is a pragmatist, Paul is a realist. We're waiting on Jesus to come back. The last thing we need is for all of us to suddenly get executed or thrown in jail or something like that. Let's just play nice. And so this is a text that's going into the lion's den. And I think it is probably just a way to placate whatever authorities might be hearing about this. Because Paul is not aware of any other like political power out there. Paul is not planning for any future where Rome has fallen and someone else has taken Rome's place. This can only be referring to Rome. And so I think it's just a way to say, hey, the powers that be, sure, God put you there. Great. We're not going to give you a hard time just because that's going to be the easiest way to facilitate the rest of his rhetorical goals. I mean, he's not the author of Revelation, who is literally calling them Satan. He's taking a very different approach.
So I want to take some super chat questions. So we're going to
Yeah.
start with some from your end.
Okay.
Julia says, thank you both for all you do. Well, thank you, Julia.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind words.
Another super chat for Dan. Visions and revisions. No question there.
Thank you, Visions and Revisions.
Yeah. Joseph Nobles says, can any of the unaccepted Pauline letters be dated before or after 70 CE?
I don't know about the disputed ones like Colossians. I think Second Thessalonians they would probably date to after 70 CE. Certainly the pastoral epistles. I think they are probably coming from like between 100 and maybe 110 CE, so into the 2nd century. It's possible that Colossians and Ephesians come from before 70 CE, but I think I would have to look up commentaries to see what the trend, see what the trend is. But I imagine that those are probably coming in the last quarter of the 1st century CE.
We got a couple more super chats from your end.
Okay.
There's revisions again. Says, I'm reading St. Augustine, and already back then, there was animosity towards the Jews. When did that start? And where is it written into the New Testament? Is it written anywhere in the New Testament?
Yeah, Augustine was definitely not a fan of Jewish folks. There's quite a bit of anti-Semitism in there, and there are a lot of scholars who will make the case that the Gospel of John is rather anti-Semitic and kind of lumping all of the antagonists to Jesus together as the Jews. But a lot of our understanding of what's going on with John has to do with the Sitz im Leben. Where are we situating John socially? Is John part of a community that has been kicked out by the broader Jewish authorities? Can we even distinguish the Jesus followers of the Johannine community from Judaism by this time? Has there already been a parting of the ways? A lot of what we think about anti-Semitism in the New Testament is going to come down to that. I think the Gnostic literature already in the 2nd century CE is certainly adopting something that could be called anti-Semitic, particularly in the representation of the God of the Hebrew Bible as this fumbling JV squad, corrupt deity that's out to imprison people. And I think Marcion's rejection of the entire Hebrew Bible, that kind of stuff, I think, is already rather anti-Semitic. But by the time of Augustine, it's getting pretty escalated.
JD Mac 44, another super chat from your end. In Matthew 24, Jesus references Noah, seeming to describe the flood events as historical. Does the language in any way suggest otherwise?
I don't think anything in the language suggests that there's any kind of nuance that is suggesting it's not historical. I think the authors are probably just presupposing the historicity of what they're reading about in the scriptures. I mean, you see that, for instance, in Jude's quotation of the book of Enoch, saying in the Enoch, the seventh from Adam said this, which presupposes its historicity and authenticity.
John Gear, thank you for your super chat. Would monotheist be the best description of Paul?
I don't think so. I would argue that there's no monotheism as we have historically used the term today in the Bible. I just participated, in fact, in a conference with a bunch of scholars at Brown University arguing against the existence of monotheism in the Bible. And one of those scholars was Paula Friedrichsen, who recently published a wonderful paper in the Harvard Theological Review entitled Philo, Herod, Paul, and the Many Gods of Ancient Jewish quote-unquote monotheism, which I think makes a very good case that Paul recognizes the existence of other gods. I have a good friend named David Burnett, who is working on his doctoral dissertation right now and is arguing that Paul's cosmos are replete with gods, but he sees this narrative winding up, the apocalyptic end coming, and the gods that are at least opposed to the God of Israel are all doomed to die. And only the angels and those who are obedient and subordinate to God will continue to exist. But humanity will be raised up to basically be deified. So I don't think monotheist works.
Here's a super chat from your end. Hard work says, can you both give each other a fit check?
Yeah, so that's the outfit. I'm actually wearing a Grip 6 shirt. Grip 6 is a belt company that a friend of mine helped start. They make really cool belts. In fact, their belts are used by SpaceX when they send people into space. So check them out. But yeah, no cool comic tee today.
I don't really have anything to show myself. So, yeah. I want to go back on discussing like the anti-Semitism you were bringing up earlier. Like, what do you make of 1 Thessalonians 2:16 when it talks about the Jews killed Jesus and then the wrath came upon them at last for what they had done to Jesus and the prophets? What do you make of that?
Let me pull that up real quick.
I'm just paraphrasing loosely what it said.
Yeah. But wrath has overtaken them at last. Yeah, I think there's, depending on where you put this, I mean, they were not having a great time in the middle of the 1st century CE when it comes to Rome. And yeah, I don't have strong feelings about this. I would probably need to look into that to see what other scholars have said, if they think there's actually a historical event that is in view here, or if they just think that their general kind of marginalization and disenfranchisement is what Paul is talking about. But yeah, that's a question I don't have a very clear answer to. Unfortunately, I wish I did.
What do you think Paul thought of the execution of Jesus? Because in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he talks about vague earthly powers, doesn't really say who they are, that's behind Jesus' death. And then, of course, in 1 Thessalonians, he says the Jews killed Jesus. So what do you think is going on there of all that?
I think Paul certainly had some idea of some kind of malevolent divine forces inspiring this. But at the same time, if there is rhetorical utility, laying the blame at the feet of Jewish folks. I don't think he's one to back away from that opportunity. But Paul talks an awful lot about powers and principalities in both the genuine and the spurious Pauline epistles that are references to just the forces of the cosmos. In fact, what is it in, or is that in, that might not be in a Pauline text. No, it's in Ephesians. So one of the not authentic Pauline letters, he talks about the cosmokratoras, the cosmic rulers of this of the darkness of this world. So Paul certainly sees all kinds of divine forces in play behind the activities of folks who are fighting against the interests of followers of Jesus.
What do you make of that line in Ephesians when it talks about the wall of separation has come down? And since many believe that it's a pseudo Pauline, could that be talking about the destruction of the temple, perhaps?
That sounds an awful lot like the if they're trying to connect it with the veil of the temple coming down, that strikes me as a problematic reading, unless they're writing in light of the Gospels, which is certainly not impossible. But yeah, I don't think we're yet at the point where we can talk about a parting of the ways between followers of Jesus and Judaism. But yeah, this is one of the ones where there are a variety of different interpretations, and I am happier to suspend judgment than try to throw my my preference behind a given interpretation. Yeah, that's one where I kind of leave it to the others to decide and see what they come up with. I don't recall the last person I read on that issue, but it's been a few years.
So in general, in what is believed to be the authentic letters of Paul, is Paul basically trying to bring together people that are in disagreement and say we're all one under Christ. If you're a man, or a woman, or a slave, or you're free, whatever, you're all under Christ. It's no big deal. We're all under Christ. Is he trying to? He's like he gets upset in Galatians when there is division. He gets upset, I think, in the Corinthian letters, or at least one of them. He's saying these things because he wants people to get along. It says, "Look, we're all going to be fine here, one way or the other. Christ is coming; it's going to be soon, and we're all under Him, and that's all that matters." Is that basically what he's trying to do? What he's trying to say?
I think there's some nuance to that. The idea that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, man nor woman, but all are one in Christ, I think is probably oriented in a soteriological direction. In other words, is because elsewhere Paul is about affirming a lot of the kind of household expectations and the social roles that people play. Paul does put men above women. Paul puts the children and the enslaved people below. And so Paul is endorsing, to some degree, kind of the standard household politics of first century Greco-Roman worlds. Not so much as in some of the later pseudo-Pauline epistles where they talk about, exactly who's supposed to be in charge. But when it kind of erases those lines of distinction, I don't think Paul is saying we need to live like this right now, like we don't recognize a distinction. I think Paul is probably saying, let's continue to get along in the stations where we are and look forward to no such distinctions in God. That's God's perspective. And while we respect these socially conventionalized roles and hierarchies on earth, we can look forward to something better later on. But that if I was able to ask Paul any question, it would probably be why the seeming disparity between the rhetoric about those social roles and hierarchies and the rhetoric about no such distinctions.
What do you think Paul's primary goal was?
That's a difficult one. I think it was probably to try to overcome disunity and achieve unity in the way Paul envisioned it for followers of Jesus in the churches that he had established. And I imagine that he, like James, like Peter, like other leaders in the early church, thought that his vision ought to be the vision for the whole church. And he happens to be, I think, the one who was most successful in getting his vision out there into the world and cemented into the foundations of Christianity. Even though it is alongside a bunch of people writing after his death, trying to leverage his authority. But I think he was trying to bring the followers of Jesus together, unite them, so that they could achieve everything that God had wanted for them. But there obviously would have been multiple different layers to his rhetorical goals as a whole.
And what do you make of the much later story that we're told about Paul's death under Emperor Nero, his supposed beheading? Because that seems to show up in the late 2nd century, and Clement doesn't seem to suggest that's what happened.
Yeah, I think that's a later tradition that
Mhm.
that just develops. I don't know that we have any kind of data that would support that story.
Mm. All right, let's go back to the super chat questions. The next two are coming from your end. The debater says, discuss the foundation stone in the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
In the Al-Aqsa, well, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is actually the building that's on the south end of the Temple Mount, and so I don't know if there's, I don't think there's any kind of foundation stone there, but if they mean the foundation stone that is in the Dome of the Rock, that is where a lot of folks think that the Holy of Holies for the first temple was located. But I've never been in there. I'm not allowed to go in there, and I would never try to go in there. So I don't know that there's been. I don't think there's been any real like modern archaeological, certainly not excavation, but even investigation into the foundation stone, because they wouldn't be allowed in there. So I don't know that we have a ton of information. Anybody could have carved the little trenches and edges and everything into the stone that are there. So I don't know that they go all the way back to the first temple. So I wish we did know. I mean, I think it's a fascinating artifact, but there's just a lot we don't know.
Paul says, was Jesus born in Bethlehem, Jerusalem possible?
I think most scholars would say Jesus was probably born in Nazareth, and that his birth in Bethlehem is a secondary tradition that developed with the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, because this concern probably arose for the need to fulfill messianic prophecy about Jesus coming out of Bethlehem. So, but the nativity accounts in Matthew and in Luke tell entirely different stories about how Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which suggests that they were crafted so that Jesus's birth could be relocated down to Jerusalem. But I think most scholars today would say probably Nazareth.
Terry Tracer super chats from my own. Thank you for your super chat, Terry. Paul would have mentioned James's death, wouldn't he?
I don't know that we have a clear idea. I mean, Josephus mentions James's execution. I don't remember who it was under. I don't remember what time period Josephus puts it in. It might have been right around the same time as Paul's. So I don't know if he knew about it. I mean, I don't know that he would have had a reason to mention it. That's the kind of thing he probably would have talked to congregations in person about. I mean, these letters that he's writing back and forth are pretty administrative. They're like, hey, you wrote to me about this issue. Here's my counsel on this. I don't think a PS. Did you guys hear about James? So sad. That doesn't make a ton of sense to me. In one of Paul's epistles.
And now the super chats from your end. The debater again. Thoughts on the Ark of the Covenant?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts on the Ark of the Covenant. In fact, I have a whole chapter of my open access book, Adoni's Divine Images, that talks about the Ark of the Covenant and how it was probably originally a type of divine image that may have held miniature, or at least a shrine model that would have held miniature divine images, similar to other things that we find in and around the land of Israel and Palestine, as well as in places like Egypt. Now, what happened to it? I think it was probably destroyed in the pre-exilic period. So I don't think there is any legitimacy to traditions about it being carted off to Ethiopia or about it being buried under the Garden Tomb, which is Ron Wyatt's theory. I don't think it's going to play a role in any future geopolitical events. I think it was probably melted down for the metals thousands of years ago and will never be seen again.
Bob Dobbs, super chat from my own, thank you. Assuming sufficiently advanced civilizations make exponentially more simulated civilizations than we were likely made by an imperfect demiurge angel, Yahweh make them and us, or he one of them? What do you think about that?
Well, in the Gnostic cosmology, Adoni is one of the was one of the lesser deities that is labeled the demiurge. I don't think that he would have been labeled an angel in the Gnostic literature. But then Adoni also made their own angels. But yeah, I don't know what, like, this is not a historical question. This sounds like a hypothetical question. So it seems to me it would be a question of what your preference is, what you would like to be the situation. And yeah, that sounds like a more theological question than I normally like to answer.
S. Mill, thank you for your super chat. He is just surprisingly progressive with Jewish law, but conservative in everything else. That may be the combination that really made it snowball.
Yeah, I think certainly Paul was progressive in some regards, but very conservative in others, particularly when it came to things like sex, where Paul was might even have been asexual, and so yeah, when it comes to Greco-Roman Jewish philosophy, Paul sides with the more conservative end of things pretty consistently, except when it comes to the responsibility of incoming Christians to Jewish law. So yeah, that certainly could be one of the things that helped it snowball.
Jesus Tales, thank you for your super chat. What about Priscilla and Paul? Would a strong man follow a book written by Priscilla?
Would a strong man, as in kind of the stereotype of your capital S strong man, or just a man who is confident and strong? I think it would be, yeah, it would not have gotten a lot of attention if Priscilla had been the author of all of these things. But today, certainly there would be no issue with that. But yeah, I think in first century Greco-Roman world, there would have been trouble with a woman writing this literature. But at the same time, Christianity had a reputation for being a religion for, or a tradition for, slaves and women. So it was characterized by giving positions of prominence to traditionally marginalized communities, which is why it was denigrated by a lot of the Roman authorities. But then we see the internal discussions are very much about women knowing their place.
We got Dan Super Chat. Sean Gibson says, so any advice on the Ugaritic text?
Yeah, read them. Find a good translation. Nicholas Wyatt has a great translation. Simon Parker has a great translation. If you want the best commentary and translation on the Ball cycle, you have Mark Smith's 2-volume commentaries that are a little pricey, but there's an awful lot in the Ugaritic literature that helps us better understand what's going on in the Hebrew Bible. I don't know that it has much relevance to Paul, but certainly incredibly important text for understanding the background of the Hebrew Bible.
Terry Tracer says, Eisenman says Saul tried to kill James. Thoughts?
Doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me. That sounds pretty speculative. I don't know that there are any data that could be marshaled for that.
Here to Learn says, what did I am the way, the truth, and light mean? Since Jesus never identified as God, what was he really trying to say?
I think he was really trying to say that the Johannine picture of Jesus is as the logos, which in Philo's cosmology, which is kind of Stoic / Platonic, the world of the flesh and the world of the divine are separated by a virtually uncrossable gulf. But the logos is the way to cross that gulf. That is how the divine, which is spirit, which is unchanging, which is eternal, could actually participate in the corruptible, changeable world of the flesh. And so everything in the material world that we see that is good is the work of the logos. They are behind the creative acts and everything like that. And so in identifying as the logos, Jesus is saying that they basically are the one responsible for God's activity in the world of the flesh. And also John represents Jesus as the only way back to the Father. And so I think it's just saying everything that's good in this world is comes through me. Not necessarily originates with me, or it originates with the Father, but comes through the Logos, which is God's kind of extension into the human world.
Gary Mayer says, my believing family knows so little of what you focus on. Why the breakdown between 1, scholarship, 2, clergy, and 3, laity? How can scholarship help?
That's a discussion that's been ongoing for a long time, and I can recall in 2011 having long lunch discussions with other members of my cohort at Trinity Western University, talking about how the information that scholars are learning can be passed down into the pews. A lot of the clergy learn about critical scholarship. It depends on where they go to school. If they go to a Bible college, they're just going to learn how to undermine it or pretend to undermine it. If they go to a seminary, they're probably a good seminary, they're probably going to be taught some of those methodologies, and they're probably going to be somewhat familiar with it. But there are an awful lot of clergy who get those educations and then either just leave it all behind or are afraid to actually use it in their work because it can be a threat to power structures of the church. When it comes to the laity, they don't have the luxury of, for the most part, they don't have the luxury, the time, the resources, the money to go get educated in ancient languages and get all these primary texts and all that kind of stuff. And the clergy are probably not going to be packaging it for them so that they can easily access it, because that clergy is probably, they want to keep their job. And, we have history is littered with examples of people who tried to inject what they were doing with critical scholarship. And if they were in the wrong tradition or in the wrong institution, then they get let go. So I think some of the power structures that are in place make it difficult for all of that stuff to work its way downstream, which is why I think public scholarship is so important. And that's how can scholars help? I'm trying to be a model of one way that scholars can help by trying to be accessible as a resource for making making critical scholarship about the Bible and religion more accessible. And I would love to see more and more scholars joining, not just on social media, but in their own communities, finding ways to make scholarship available.
The debater says, your thoughts on the life of Brian.
A classic. No notes. It's wonderful.
Captain T says, do you believe in a God? Does the evidence support that the Bible was just made up by humans?
I am an active member of the LDS Church, so I'm a Mormon. But on social media, that's irrelevant. So I don't go any further than just acknowledging my my belief system. The evidence support that the Bible is just made up by humans. I don't think there's any way the evidence could point in any other direction. So I would say that yes, all of the available evidence points in the direction of the Bible being the work of human industry. Certainly, there's nothing non-human that is involved in the articulation of the biblical text.
Paul says, Micah 5:2, referring to Bethlehem, clan, or town.
That's where the prince will come out. Yeah. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, what is that? The Alphe Yehudah, from you shall come forth. I think in this time period, there's not much of the line of distinction between a geographic designation and the people who occupy that geographic designation is probably thin, because a lot of times the people take their name from the geographic designation, or the geographic designation takes its name from the people. So, with the Tetragrammaton, the divine name, for instance, a lot of scholars think is mentioned not as a divine name in some 14th and 13th century Egyptian inscriptions, but as the name either of a land or a people. It's used in a way kind of like this, where it's not easy to tell the difference. But it does seem to refer to the clans of Judah, the Eleph of one of the Alphim of Judah. So maybe we would lean in that direction.
Smil says, what is the relationship between Spirit of God in the Old Testament and dwelling of God with people, like cloud following them, pillar of fire, tabernacle with them?
That's an interesting question. There are a lot of different, sometimes personified, sometimes materialized, but not really personified loci of divine presence and power and things like that. I think that the idea of the pillar of fire and the cloud is supposed to be a way for people to think about what they see when they look at the tabernacle or the temple. Because if the temple is active and the priests are engaged in those daily sacrifices, what's going to be hovering over the temple? A cloud of smoke. So during the day, you're going to see a cloud of smoke over the temple. And maybe saying God was with the Israelites as a cloud is a way to help them think of that cloud of smoke over the temple as God's presence. At night, what are you going to see? That cloud of smoke is probably going to be lit up. There are going to be a lot of fires and things like that going on. And so if you think of that as a pillar of fire, maybe that's a way to think of God's presence in the nighttime. But it changes and it's different from place to place. Deuteronomy treats it one way, Exodus treats it another way. That's another thing that I discuss to some degree in my book. You have the kavod of God that sometimes seems to be identified with the cloud and the fire. I don't think you really have the spirit being identified with the cloud and the fire. The spirit is more God's active agent rather than some visible manifestation, and it's usually associated with wind more than with visible phenomena.
Sean says, I see quite a bit of Christian versus Muslim debates, but not much content on YouTube in the way of Tanakh versus Old Testament, Jewish versus Christian debates, outside of a handful of Christians who heavily edit vids.
Yeah, I don't know about active debates. I know there are certainly representatives of the different communities, Jewish and Christian, who are very active in places like YouTube. But yeah, I don't think I see them involved in a whole lot of debates. Not nearly as much as you see between Christians and Muslims. I don't have thoughts on that. I don't really participate in debates. For me, they don't advance the academic football very much for me. I think there's more value in giving someone the time and the opportunity to consider arguments, to go look things up, to go contemplate primary texts and mull things over, and then come back and produce a response than these gotcha questions and claims that so frequently characterize these debates.
Terry Trasser says, thoughts on Talpiot tomb.
I think, like the majority of scholars, that this is unlikely to be the burial place of Jesus of Nazareth. But it's certainly a very fascinating archaeological find and location. But yeah, I don't think that many scholars are convinced that that's where Jesus was buried.
Tommy Thomas, no question there. Celio Jr. says, hi, Dan. Your thoughts on the book of Daniel, especially the prophecies? What scholars say about the actual age of the book?
Hi, Celio. Thanks for the question. I think the book of Daniel is a collection of court tales for the first half of the book, and then apocalyptic visions in the second half of the book. That the court tales probably come from the Persian period and the Greco-Roman period. The apocalyptic visions probably come primarily from the Greco-Roman period, but the book probably, and some of them, the latest layers and probably the main layers were probably composed in the early 160s BCE. And then the text probably came together in the form that we have it shortly after that. I think it's quite possible that some of the fragments of the book of Daniel that we have from Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls may actually predate the form of the book of Daniel as we have it. In other words, the book of Daniel may have been circulating at Qumran in an earlier form than what we have in the Masoretic text and tradition. And the fact that we have a prayer of Nabonidus and other texts that are kind of parallel to some of the things that we see in the book of Daniel may constitute evidence that it was still forming editorially when it was being circulated at Qumran.
So, in my closing question, how do you think, like the best, most cautious way one could read Paul's letters, the authentic letters, what is believed to be the authentic letters of Paul?
I think reading them in the context of a situation where Paul was trying to curate what was going on in these communities in what they understood to be the final years of the temporal existence of the earth. They were expecting Jesus to come back immediately. I think if you have that interpretive lens, I think that makes better sense of a lot of what Paul is advocating for, a lot of what Paul is saying. And I think you have to read them without the rest of the New Testament forming part of your interpretive lens, because it didn't exist at the time. Nobody would have had access to it. And so I don't think we can think of the Gospels. I don't think we can think of the book of Revelation. I don't think we can think of the other literature of the New Testament when we're reading Paul, if we want to try to understand Paul on Paul's own terms. But that's a phenomenally difficult thing to do. And it's not going to be helpful for most attempts to read it in a way that makes it meaningful and useful to us today. But if you want to understand Paul on Paul's own terms, I would suggest that that's what we strive for.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dan.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate your time, Jacob.
Likewise, and I want to thank everybody that super chatted to both Dan and to myself. And I want to thank everybody else for watching, and I'll see everybody later.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.